Officer Daniel Hayes stood frozen, his gun trembling in his hand as the acrid smell of gunpowder filled the cool night air. On the perfectly manicured lawn in front of him lay the lifeless body of a young boy, blood spreading across the grass like a cruel stain. The boy's unblinking eyes stared up at the sky, as if searching for answers that would never come. Clutched in his small hand was a basketball, innocent and ordinary, now tragically misplaced in this grim scene. The gated community was unnaturally quiet, the silence broken only by the occasional chirp of distant crickets. Porch lights flickered on one by one, curious and terrified neighbors peering through parted curtains, too afraid to step outside. Hayes's heart pounded like a drum, his breaths shallow and panicked. In the distance, the faint wail of sirens grew louder, each passing second dragging him deeper into the abyss of realization. This wasn't supposed to happen, he muttered, his voice trembling. He had meant to fire a warning shot, just to scare the kid off. He shouldn't have been here. He shouldn't have run. Hayes's voice trailed off as his gaze shifted to the black sedan pulling up in the driveway nearby. The car door opened, and a tall man in a dark suit stepped out, his every move commanding attention. Judge Lionel Carter, renowned for his relentless pursuit of justice, froze as he took in the scene. Confusion turned to dread, then pure horror, as his eyes locked on the boy lying motionless on the grass. His knees buckled as he sprinted forward, collapsing beside the child. "Marcus!" His voice cracked, trembling as he knelt, his hands hovering inches above the boy's body. His fingers shook, hesitant to touch his son as though doing so would make the nightmare real. "No. Marcus, no." The sirens crescendoed as red and blue lights painted the scene in chaotic bursts. Hayes could feel his knees weaken, the weight of his actions sinking in like quicksand. He had shot a child who, as he now realized, was Judge Carter's son. The judge's tear-streaked face turned to Hayes, his voice barely more than a growl. "You'll pay for this," he said, his words heavy with rage and grief. Hours earlier, the day had begun like any other for Officer Hayes. Sitting in his patrol car, he had been sipping coffee, lazily scrolling through his phone when the call came in. A report of trespassing in an affluent neighborhood. The caller described a suspicious-looking black teenager wandering around. Hayes sighed, annoyed. It sounded like another routine call, the kind that never led to anything serious. Meanwhile, Marcus Carter had been shooting hoops at the community basketball court. The 13-year-old loved basketball almost as much as he loved pestering his older sister or binge-reading comic books. That evening, he had promised his mom he'd be home for dinner by 7 p.m., but as he played, his ball bounced over the fence and onto the private property of a nearby house. Unthinking, Marcus climbed the fence and retrieved it, not knowing that vigilant neighbors had already called the police. By the time Hayes arrived, Marcus was walking back toward the court, ball in hand. Hayes stepped out of his patrol car, resting a hand on his holstered weapon. "Hey, stop right there," Hayes shouted, his tone sharp and authoritative. Marcus froze mid-step, turning to face the officer. Confused, he stammered, "I was just—" "Hands up," Hayes interrupted, his voice cutting through the boy's words like a blade. Marcus hesitated, his basketball slipping from his grip and landing softly on the grass. Fear gripped him as he raised his trembling hands, unsure of what he had done to deserve this. Hayes's adrenaline surged, his judgment clouded by assumptions. The hoodie Marcus wore, the way he froze, it all seemed off to Hayes. When Marcus instinctively took a step backward, Hayes's training and biases collided in the worst way imaginable. He drew his weapon. "I said stop," he barked, his voice laced with panic. Frightened and overwhelmed, Marcus turned and ran. The world seemed to slow as Hayes's pulse thundered in his ears. Without thinking, he fired. The shot echoed across the neighborhood, and in an instant, Marcus fell to the ground. At the Carter residence, Judge Lionel Carter had been in his study reviewing case files, oblivious to the tragedy unfolding nearby. His wife, Eleanor, was preparing dinner while their daughter, Lily, was upstairs chatting with her friends. They were a family like any other, busy, content, and secure in the belief that their neighborhood was safe. But that illusion shattered when the phone rang. A neighbor's shaky voice on the other end informed Judge Carter of an incident near the basketball court. Panic rose in his chest as he grabbed his keys and drove over, his mind racing with possibilities. When he arrived and saw his son's lifeless body sprawled on the lawn, a scream lodged itself in his throat. This wasn't an incident. This was a nightmare. The sound of approaching medics barely registered as Carter cradled Marcus's head, his tears falling onto his son's still, blood-stained face. Nearby, Officer Hayes stood frozen, staring at the scene with wide, unseeing eyes. His mind raced with excuses, explanations, and regrets. But Judge Carter wasn't listening to anything Hayes had to say. All he saw was his son, his brilliant, funny, basketball-loving son, gone. "You'll face me in court, Officer Hayes," the judge said through clenched teeth, his voice cold and deadly. "And I'll make sure you never forget Marcus's name." The courtroom buzzed with tension as the trial of Officer Daniel Hayes began. The room was packed with reporters, activists, and concerned citizens, all eager to witness the outcome of a case that had shaken the nation. Seated at the defense table, Hayes looked pale and defeated, his hands trembling as he fidgeted with his pen. Across the aisle, Judge Lionel Carter sat with an unyielding posture, his grief hardened into cold resolve. Beside him, Eleanor Carter clutched Marcus's hoodie tightly, as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. Their daughter, Lily, sat silently, her expression a mix of pain and anger. The prosecutor, Sarah Dean, was known for her sharp intellect and passionate pursuit of justice. As she rose to deliver her opening statement, the courtroom fell silent. "Marcus Carter was just 13 years old," Sarah began, her voice steady yet laced with emotion. "He loved basketball, comic books, and spending time with his family. But on a quiet evening in his own neighborhood, his life was cut short, not because of a crime, but because he was seen as a threat." Officer Daniel Hayes didn't see a child. He saw a suspect, and that assumption led to a tragic, irreversible mistake. The defense attorney countered with a narrative of split-second decisions. "Officers face dangerous situations every day," he argued. Daniel Hayes responded to a perceived threat under immense pressure. "This is a tragedy, yes, but not murder." The trial progressed with both sides presenting evidence, witnesses, and expert testimonies. Each detail painted a clearer picture of what had happened that fateful evening. The prosecution relied heavily on unaltered security footage from a nearby home, which showed Marcus walking away with his hands raised, his basketball tucked under his arm. The courtroom collectively gasped as the footage froze on the moment Hayes fired. Tears streamed down Eleanor's face, and Lionel clenched his fists, his jaw tight with barely restrained rage. Sarah Dean's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "This footage speaks louder than any words I could say," she told the jury. "This wasn't a decision made under pressure. This was recklessness. This was bias. And it cost an innocent child his life." The defense struggled to maintain their argument, focusing on Hayes' state of mind and the chaotic nature of law enforcement. But the jury couldn't ignore the evidence or the haunting testimonies of those who knew Marcus. Friends described him as a kind-hearted, ambitious boy who dreamed of becoming an engineer. His teachers spoke of his bright future, now stolen. Outside the courthouse, protests swelled with each passing day. Crowds held signs reading "Justice for Marcus" and "Stop Police Violence." The case had become a flashpoint for a larger conversation about systemic racism and police accountability. Inside the Carter home, grief hung heavy in the air. Eleanor spent hours in Marcus's room, her fingers tracing over his comic books and posters. Lily, once cheerful and outgoing, had grown quiet and withdrawn, her laughter replaced by an ever-present sadness. And Lionel poured his pain into preparation. "I'll make sure the world knows who Marcus was," he told Eleanor one evening. "And I'll make sure Hayes pays for what he's done." Eleanor's voice trembled. "He was just a boy," she whispered. "He had so much ahead of him." The trial reached its climax as Hayes took the stand. His voice shook as he recounted the events of that night, tears streaming down his face. "I didn't mean for this to happen," he said, his words barely audible. I thought he was a threat. I was scared." Sarah Dean's cross-examination was relentless. "You fired at a child who was walking away with his hands raised," she said, her tone icy. "You made assumptions that cost him his life. Do you regret that decision?" "Yes," Hayes whispered, his voice breaking, "every second of every day." But remorse wasn't enough to sway the jury. After 3 days of deliberation, they returned with a verdict. "We find the defendant, Officer Daniel Hayes, guilty of second-degree murder." The courtroom erupted. Eleanor wept openly, clinging to Lionel, who closed his eyes as a wave of relief and sorrow washed over him. Hayes slumped in his seat, the weight of the verdict crushing him. Justice had been served, but for the Carter family, the victory felt hollow. Marcus was gone, and no verdict could bring him back. Yet, they refused to let his death be in vain. In the weeks that followed, Lionel and Eleanor founded Marcus's Light, an organization dedicated to advocating for police accountability and fostering community trust. Their mission quickly gained national attention, sparking conversations in legislative halls and inspiring families who had endured similar tragedies. One evening, Lionel stood before a mural painted in Marcus's honor. It depicted his son smiling, surrounded by stars. Lionel reached out, his fingers brushing the edge of the mural as tears welled in his eyes. "You'll always be my light, Marcus," he whispered, "and I'll never stop fighting for you." Through their pain, the Carters turned their grief into a movement, one that demanded justice, accountability, and change. Marcus's story became a beacon, illuminating the path toward a better future.